My friends and I think we were being hunted by a Wendigo. Whole story takes place on an 8-mile stretch of road in Hamlin, NY. I was 16 years old and went on a fishing trip with my 4 friends. Brian, Mike, Ethan, and Joe. The fishing spot was under a bridge 1.5 miles away from any houses. The day started out fun, everybody was excited to go fishing and smoke, and the walk to the spot went well. There were squash fields littering the sides of the main road, so we snagged a few and continued on. Also grabbing corn, we get to the spot and fish for a few hours until it was 9:30 p.m. This is where shit pops off. But before I say anything else, I want to recognize that my friend Brian is a descendant of the Navajo tribe and believes in druid stuff. I'm an atheist. We start to hear dogs barking in the distance, like a wild pack of dogs, but the chances of that being a thing are low, so we consider coyotes. We soon realize that coyotes don't bark, they yip, so that's out the window. We're all a little bit paranoid at this point, so we come to the conclusion that walking back the 8 miles and downing a bottle of rum at Brian's house was a good idea. A quarter way back, my friend Brian stops dead in his tracks in the middle of the road. The expression on his face changed from concern to the look of fear. I walked up to him wondering what was up, and he grabbed me by the wrist and pointed my hand out into the fields, and all I could see looking back at me, it was a pair of eyes the size of footballs. Me and Brian agree silently to keep it between us two as to not freak everybody out and end up getting split up, so we just kind of pick up the pace so everybody is forced to follow at our speed. Halfway back to Brian's house, we pass a white farmhouse with a cornfield across from it. Next thing I know, it feels like a plane buzzed by and there's about a 40-yard trail crashing through the corn. Oh, and all while this is happening, we hear the goddamn dogs following us. As we return at Brian's house and pull out the friggin' 12 gauge and a bottle of rum and sit on his porch, we are the same dogs from earlier start whining off in the distance like they were upset at us. I then proceeded to have night terrors while drunk at my buddy's house. Lol.
Never been more glad to have a bear nearby. Sorry for the wall of text, I'm not very good at summarizing. My family recently bought a beautiful, but overgrown piece of land in the Kootenays of British Columbia, Canada. It's a wonderful place, but my dad is frustrated with the amount of work they will have to do to live comfortably on our land. I personally love our little pocket of untouched nature, but I'm getting off topic. I thought it was strange that the previous owners seemed to be in a rush to sell the land, but I chalked it up to the uneven ground and abundance of plants. My family brought their trailer to the land, and were staying in it, while I set up a small tent nearby since there wasn't enough room for me. Soon after we started staying there, my dad and I were comfortably sitting around our fire pit stargazing and listening to the sounds of the land, when we started to hear the shrieks of something that was certainly inhuman, but also unlike any animal either of us have ever heard. It was a shrill, yet guttural growl, that was extremely drawn out and loud. My first guess was that a bear or cougar got cornered, but listening more closely quickly crushed that assumption. I started to distinguish the growl of a small bear, but that wasn't the source of the strange shriek. It soon started to sound like a bear was cornering something, and the threatened creature was trying to make a last-ditch escape while screaming in pain. Now I know you're probably thinking it must have been a cougar or something, but I have heard a cougar in a fight before. This was not a cougar. Its shrieks and howls sounded almost demonic. Soon after the noises stopped, my dad and I both decided it would be best to head to bed. While laying in my tent, I started to hear the unmistakable sound of a large creature roaming around our site. After approaching, I heard it settle into place, almost like it was sitting down and getting comfortable. I started to worry that the unidentifiable creature from earlier was stalking me, until I worked up the courage to peek out my tent's window. In the spot I heard the creature approach, I saw not a horrifying monstrosity, but a beautiful black bear. I would normally be afraid upon seeing this, except, I made eye contact with the bear and felt an overwhelming sense of safety. I know this sounds crazy, but it almost felt like the bear was watching over us, to protect us from something. Soon after noticing the bear, I heard the blood-curdling screech of the unidentifiable creature, much closer now. When the bear heard this, it tensed up, brought itself to its feet and began to growl menacingly. Only a moment after the bear began to growl, I heard a much larger creature than the bear run off in the opposite direction. I swung my head to see where the noise was coming from, and got a glance of an incredibly large deer-like animal. I didn't get a good look at it, but I remember seeing thin, skeletal, long pale arms, and legs that ended with hooves. It was also covered in a very dark, blood-like substance, implying that it had been injured recently. When I saw this, my breath caught in my throat, and I couldn't force myself to look away. I saw the trees sway and break where it was running, and then it stopped a far distance away from our land, and let out one more shriek. The few birds that were awake in that area flew away in fear, and I shuddered. I looked back to the bear, and it was once again sitting, looking at me with its kind protective eyes. I have never been more grateful to have a bear living nearby, and I no longer fear them, but I respect them.
My Wendigo encounter. This story takes place in the back country of the area I grew up in. Be warned. Some of this might be too frightening for some. Reader discretion is advised. So back in 2019 I remember there being a big uproar of unknown creatures roaming the forest, like Bigfoot and skinwalkers. But this story isn't about them. This story is about probably one of the scariest things I think I've ever heard about. The Wendigo. A few months after one of my friends Jacob mentioned this big uproar, I went to go see him since I had been away enlisted in the United States Marines. I got back after being discharged and one of the first things I did was go and see him. We're having a good old time and he brought up the idea of going out to a little hangout spot his now ex-girlfriend took him to when they wanted to get away for a few hours. So I decided why not, so I grabbed my gun and we went out to this extremely secluded area and started messing around on the old dock that was there. It had been pretty much forgotten by the looks of it, poorly maintained, and some boards were almost completely rotted through. So about 30 minutes into our shenanigans, Jacob brought up the topic of the Wendigo. The name sounded a little scary even for me. Curious, I asked him about it. He said that if you went into the woods and said Wendigo 3 times you would come across the scariest looking thing you've ever seen. Me calling his bluff, I told him to prove it. To this day, I wished I hadn't. We start walking on this little path that lead deep into the thick woods close to the Alabama state line. We walked for maybe 20-ish minutes and decided we were in a good spot. I feel it's worth knowing that it had been raining a lot over the past couple days, so the ground was completely saturated with water. I turned to Jacob and he dares me to do it. I stood there, in complete silence. The rest of the forest was almost silent as well, besides the tall pines swaying in the wind high above our heads. Reluctantly, I slowly started to say it. Wendigo. 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 Then. Nothing happened. I let out a silent sigh of relief at the fact that nothing happened. One thing about mine and Jacob's friendship is we loved it when one of us proved the other wrong about something. In our friendship of 10 years, I think it was one of the first times I had proven him wrong at anything. We started to talk a little bit of shit back and forth at each other when we heard a noise in the distance. Me still having the reflexes I had from the Marines, I immediately snapped towards the direction of the noise, that were just then turning into noises. I started to move closer to the noises, and then shortly after we saw a few coyotes running across the path about 30 feet in front of us. I breathed another sigh of relief, but that relief didn't last long since I knew something was up. I didn't know what was up at first, but I just knew it was time for me and Jacob to leave. As we turned to leave the woods, all of a sudden, a tall pine tree started to groan and creak as it started to come down. Noticing this, and in a moment of pure instinct, I shoved Jacob forward as the tree came falling through the rest of the branches and landed right in between us. Jacob let out a cry of terror as the tree landed, and I hopped the tree to get to him. I could feel his heart pounding like a drum as I grabbed him by his shirt and yanked him to his feet. He was still terrified and still practically crying as I screamed at the top of my lungs, "Move, Jacob. Friggin' move now." I spun him around really hard, causing him to fall to his knees. I quickly got him up and we both started to sprint down the path back in the direction we came. I didn't dare look back, and neither did Jacob. I was sprinting through the woods when a familiar sound came from behind me. "Jacob! Jacob, come quick!" It was the sound of Jacob's younger sister Olivia. He turned and tried to get past me, the whole time he was screaming, "Olivia!" I stopped him and said, "Jacob, look at me. It's not her. Do you hear me? It's not her." Just then another pine tree started to buckle. I saw it just in time to tackle Jacob down to the ground as both of us were nearly crushed. I screamed at Jacob once more. "Go! Get out of here! Go now!" As I was screaming that, I pulled my gun out of my waistband and aimed it down the trail in the direction from whence we came. Jacob made it to the opening of the trail and turned back and noticed I was still aiming my gun down the trail. "Bradley, get out of there! Come on, hurry!" I turned and started sprinting towards him. As I made it into the clearing a good 50 feet, I turned and me and Jacob both saw it. The thing we had ushered into showing itself. The Wendigo. It stood about 9 feet tall on its hind legs. There was practically no meat on its bones, it had really skinny legs and even skinnier arms. Its skin a pale white, almost like a vampire's. But the thing I noticed the most about it were the eyes. A vibrant blue, almost like lightsaber blue for those who have seen Star Wars. Having had enough fear, I raised my gun and fired at the Wendigo. Jacob, not sticking around to see if I had killed it, turned and ran towards the car. I turned and did the same thing as he passed me. That was my first experience with this so-called Wendigo, and I pray, almost every night, I never have to encounter something that terrifying again.
Windigo Hill. The following account is 100% truthful and took place at 3 a.m. on October 31, 2020. My friends and I always go on walks together past midnight. In the woods, along the roads, anything. We usually have 4 people, but this time Ben, the guy whose house we were staying at, could have 6 people over. So the 6 of us walked along the road to this Verizon tower on this hill. The stars look very nice up there at night, so we always do it. We get halfway up the hill and we're feeling uneasy. It's a full moon on Halloween after all. Nick, the oldest and most stoic out of us, the one who never jokes about or believes in the paranormal or anything, points his flashlight ahead on the trail. "What the F is that?" He rarely swears, so this was another attention-grabbing thing. We all stop and look ahead. About 20 paces ahead of us there it was. 8 feet tall, white as snow. A skin and bone, lanky, bipedal being within a stone's throw. 6 people all saw this at the same time. It takes off into the woods at superhuman speed. We stop and are silent for a moment. We immediately start asking if everyone saw it, and everyone did. We argue and cuss, and I try my hardest to convince the others to turn back and forget it. But fearless Ben, who doesn't believe in anything, begs to push on. We do. Now I've cut down a lot of trees in my day, so I know what it sounds like when one falls. On the continuation of our voyage, less than a minute later, a tree slams to the ground on the side of the trail. It didn't fall, it was pulled down with force. We stop and argue. We push on. A minute after that, we hear a rustle and a loud, painful chirp from a bird. We make it to the tower and look around us. The top of the hill is mostly devoid of trees, so we look down at the path where it ran. Ben is still trying to convince us he isn't afraid. We decide to run the half-mile back down to his house. We get there and Ben starts crying. He has never ever believed in anything his whole life. But he saw something up there. We all saw something up there. I still see it sometimes when I close my eyes. We've gone back up there, but we haven't seen anything. I've done a lot of research into it. I have no doubt in my mind it was a Wendigo.
There were 2 Wendigo outside my dad's house last night. So, last night my friends and I were driving around aimlessly and ended up on the side of town near my deceased father's house. I go there from time to time to sit on the steps, say hi, and that I miss him. And since every year for Valentine's Day since I was a kid my dad was my Valentine, I really wanted to stop by the house and give it a hug, but I don't think I'm going back. At around 11 p.m., We stop at the top of the road and I run down the exponential function of a driveway, run up to the garage and hug the house before quickly running up the stairs to the front porch. I rest my head on the front door and I feel my entire body start shaking like I'm sobbing when only a few tears run down my face. Just as this overwhelming feeling starts to come over me and I feel lightheaded, my friend, Duke, calls me and says to get back to the car. He'll tell me why when I get there. Without hesitation, I sprint up the icy driveway without stopping, and thank God not slipping and falling. When I get to the car, we take off doing 50 down the road. I'm still crying and can barely breathe, and my friend, Riley, keep asking me if I'm okay and if I need anything. When I'm able to pull myself together, I ask what made them call me back to the car. Duke doesn't say anything for a few minutes and keeps driving while I keep pestering him about what he saw that made him call me. When we get to a stop sign, he grips the wheel tighter and says he saw a head poking out behind my dad's house, a little bit taller than the garage doors. After a minute of silence, I asked him what it looked like. Duke said it popped its head out around the side of the house 2 times, and by the time I was sprinting up the stairs, Riley saw another head come out behind the neighbor's house, that she initially thought was a dog head but soon realized the head was too massive to be a dog's. We take off down the road and all go and crash at my house after getting some McDonald's, with Duke checking the windows until we had fallen asleep. I think he may have spotted another one outside my house. My dog was flipping out and trying to get to all the doors in my house at once. I don't know what happened. I don't know why my whole body was shaking and why I felt I was going to pass out, but I think my dad protected me. And I know I'm not going back to that house.
Well, I saw it. Hi. I don't really know how to start this post, it's my first one. At the time of writing this, I am living in western Pennsylvania, a little south of Pittsburgh. I was in Boy Scouts for most of my life, so I feel very comfortable in the woods and go camping often. Upon hearing Governor Wolf's school closure plan, I decided that it was time for some cold weather camping. It was March, it wasn't that cold, but it did drop to 40 F at night, and the people who I went weren't really avid campers. If you're from Pittsburgh, you may know the Boggs campsite on the Montour Trail. That's where we went. They, of course, only brought weed and alcohol and didn't bring any sleeping bags, blankets, or pillows, so naturally I assumed they were gonna have to sit by the fire all night. It was light when we first got there and the fire pit was still smoldering, very cool. We used the coals from the previous campers' fire to light ours, and immediately I knew that I would have to provide wood for the fire until I went to bed. They passed out beers at around 3 p.m. Times are gonna be a bit dodgy because I wasn't near my phone, and after having 2 to 3 beers I just wanted dinner. Now, that they did for me. They made ramen noodles and cheese, which was amazing. They had a weird name for it, and burgers over the fire. By this time it would have had to have been close to 5 p.m. because it started to rain a little bit, as was forecasted, so we took shelter in the lean-to shelter that was on site, and occasionally one of them would throw some sticks on the fire. Sticks were all they seemed to be able to find, even though I brought 2 saws and an axe, and I would cut up some logs. By the time the rain stopped, all 4 of us smoked a blunt and were sitting around the fire. I was light out, so we'll call it 7 p.m. After a while of just hanging out, they asked if I had any blankets. I always have blankets. Nothing special, but we've had some pretty bad snowstorms in the past, and a couple scratchy car blankets are always useful. They each got a blanket except for R, as we'll call him, who got my summer sleeping bag that I brought just in case. By now it was dark, 9 to 9:30 p.m., and the fire was getting low. I start off to find some more wood because they wanted to smoke another blunt. Now you have to understand that I'm 6 feet 5 inches and a semi-frequent user of the devil's lettuce, so my tolerance is kinda high. I return with the wood and we spark up another blunt, a smaller one, and just kinda hang out and talk and listen to music while we're high as shit. Good times. Eventually the fire, again, dies down a little bit, and, again, it's my job to get more wood. Because we had been there for a while and there were people there before us, most of the wood near the shelter was either really small or all used up, so I had to keep going farther and farther away from camp to find wood. 12:30 a.m., close to 50 F still, so we're all doing well. I have a flashlight, a really nice one that I use for scuba diving, that is kinda bright, so I use it on the low setting on land. At this point I'm far enough away from camp that my friends can't really see me. There's like an embankment between the Montour Trail and someone's driveway that you have to cross to get to more woods, but I'm comfortable alone because I knew what I was doing and they could FS hear me if I needed them. I start to hear a weird whistling sound, kinda like someone inhaling through a snorkel, but I chalk it up to the wind. The air was starting to get kinda cold, so I just took back what I had and put some on the fire. 1 to 2 a.m., 40°F with some wind, nothing severe. I have on 2 long sleeve shirts and an army surplus coat that is super warm, but my friends are in windbreakers and hoodies and, oh yeah, it's raining. Off to get more wood. This time I started taking into consideration the type of wood that I would collect. There was a lot of pine, but that burns fast, which is why I had to go collect it so often. The stretch of woods near the driveway was pretty much all pine, a few maples but nothing big, so I keep walking knowing that this area has both conifers and deciduous trees in close proximity to each other. As I'm wandering and collecting wood, I notice that the rain has turned to a superfine snow. Time to head back, just in case it picks up. Then the whistling started again, a lot louder now. Okay, weird, there isn't any more wind than there was before, maybe it changed the directions. I keep walking. By now I can hear the music from camp and pick up the pace a little bit. Just as I summit the embankment and prepare to clamber down the other side, a loud noise echoes behind me. Tree fell? Shining my flashlight around, I couldn't see any signs that was the case and didn't see any source. Deer knocked something over? In my head it doesn't matter because I'm back at camp anyways and I can try the marsh behind our shelter next time. 3 a.m.? They were cold. The temperature dropped to around 30°F and the wind and snow had picked up. Car blankets helped the boys a little bit, but they weren't able to go sleep in the tent that I brought without freezing, except for our who slept like a rock all night after about 3:30. We decide to finish off the weed and give the last beers a good talking to. 4:30 a.m. I'm about ready for bed at this point because I'm not super high or drunk or anything, but I was definitely tired. I offer to go collect more wood before I retire to my 0-degree sleeping bag and cot. I camp comfy when I don't have to carry it far, and they said they would join me. They must have been cold. We split up and I end up heading back to where I was before, except this time I left my flashlight on high and I made a bunch of noise to scare off that deer or whatever that was there earlier. I end up a little further away from camp than I had intended to be because there were only pine branches on the ground over here. Then the whistling starts again. This time I could tell the direction it was coming from, my left, and shined my flashlight around that area before just returning to collecting wood. Then the sound stops briefly, then picks up again in a different direction less than a minute later, this time in front of me and a little to the right, back into the pines. Maybe the branches of certain trees catch the wind just right and make the noise, I think whatever, and move on. Then on my way back the noise was following me, darting from left to right but always like right behind me. I don't see anything, so whatever. Then the noise makes like one sharp whistle and pauses, then I hear it, damn it's cold out here. It was R, but I couldn't find him with my flashlight, so I called where you at and it sounded like he turned around because I heard a branch snap and a bit of movement. I pointed my flashlight at where the sound was coming from and I didn't see R anywhere. Maybe he's behind a bush or a tree or something. I call out again, R? No reply this time, yikes. He might be lost or something because we weren't at camp and he saw my flashlight moving, so he came to look. R, where are you? Nothing. Then, louder, I'm going back to camp because I thought he was trying to scare me. Shining my flashlight around one last time, I spot something dive into a bush about 40 feet from where I had heard R turn around. I see you, big man, grab some wood and come back. Has 6 and 230 to 250 pounds. I shine the light around for a few more seconds, then turn around again and start walking. The whistling is back, cool, love that. No matter what speed I moved at, it always seemed the same distance away. I decide that I'd just kinda sit under a tree and wait for R to pass by because he had to come back sometime, right? I wanted to save the battery of my flashlight, so I turned it off and closed one eye, so it would adjust faster. By now the snow had picked up a good bit, which is another reason to stop, in case I got lost. I couldn't really see super far because there was a lot of cloud cover despite it being a full moon. The whistling never got closer, but it did start to move around a little bit, in a really odd circle. It would start in one spot, stop, then promptly start in another spot that was in a different direction. I realized that it had to be the wind or something because it was moving super fast and was moving at random. Cool, now where the hell is R? I turn on my flashlight between whistles and call out again, R. It's important to note here that the whistling never picked up while I looked around, it normally only stopped for a second or two. It was super quiet. The snow was laying on the ground and we had 2 to 3 in on the ground by now, so maybe that muffled it? Anyways, upon not hearing R, I thought that maybe I missed him or didn't hear him at all and started to head back to camp. As I stood up and brushed the dirt off my ass, I shined the flashlight around one more time. I was thinking in my head I definitely heard him. After I stood up with the wood in my arms and began to walk back towards camp, I saw something move out of the corner of my eye. My flashlight, being a diving light, has a wrist mount that I was wearing so I could use it and carry things. I turned towards and scanned the area with my flashlight. Nothing, goddamn dear. Not even 4 steps more and I saw another movement. Now the whistling was back. Damn, that gets annoying. Sounds like a fat guy who just ran up the stairs. Flashlight was on low so I could see maybe 40 feet around me and didn't see anything, but I knew it was time to pick up the pace. Now the whistling was followed by flashes of movement. Great, it's not the wind. At this point I'm speed walking. Being tall I can move if I have to, and I was definitely traveling at jogging speed. R, a lumbering beast when he runs, could not move this fast or this quietly through the woods. Nice, another thing that it's not. I decided to turn off the flashlight and move into some brush that was close by. Not sure why, but I was getting a little weirded out and had the shakes even though I was warm. It was silent again. Well, F me, what is it? Is it hunting me? Coyote? Not a coyote. There was a good period of silence, then there was whistling. This time it wasn't doing circles around me, it was just moving around where I had turned off the flashlight. My eyes adjusted and I peeked out from under the bush that I was rolled up under. I tried. Nothing, just that damned whistling. By this point I was pretty much sober, like if I got pulled over I could nail the field sobriety test. I waited for a little while, the thing just kinda looked around. Then I heard it speak. In a really gargled impression of me it called out, "Big man." It took everything I had not to panic. Holy shit. Not R, not human, not a deer, not the wind. Oh shit. Then it spoke again, R, cutting off really strangely like you just lifted the needle off of a record but picking back up again with "back to camp" still in my voice. My friggin' voice. I normally don't like hearing recordings of myself anyways, but now I really don't like them. It said a few more things, in different voices that I didn't recognize. All the voices were either talking about how cold it was or questions like "what was that" and "stop messing with me," but they all seemed like whoever was talking had some phlegm built up in their throat. Then it went quiet. I poked my head out of the bushes again and saw something sitting against a tree in the same position I had been in. Left leg straight out, right leg at an angle, hands behind my head. It could have fooled me as being R. We both kinda sit the same way, except his ADHD usually makes him fidget with his hands. Okay, so who's sitting in the woods with me? I lay there, silent, and just watch. It begins to whistle. So that's where that was coming from. It moves its hand around in a fist out in front of it, the same way that I look around with my flashlight, and then started to stand up. Oh shit, it's tall. I only weigh 166, skin and bone mostly, so when I say that this thing was skinny, don't take it lightly. I could see how thin its long spindly arms were silhouetted against the snow that coated a bush behind it. When it stood up it was hunched over. Not sure if I was slouching when I stood up, but I certainly do slouch. It walked a few paces away from the tree and stood up the whole way. Holy shit. I worked with backdrops for theater productions and the walls we use the most are around 8 feet high and this thing would have easily been able to see over one, I'm talking by at least a foot. It slowly peered around, no hair on its head and its side profile showed a super disfigured skull, the jaw hung pretty far down and there weren't really lips that stuck out but it was hard to tell because of how dark it was. It let out one final R. Big man kinda like someone with tortures would say it because they were just random words that it strung together. Then it screamed. My dad used to take me to airshows a lot as a kid and this has to have been the same pitch and volume as an F-16. I couldn't move. It peered around, head just seemingly sweeping the area. Then it crouches down and leaps for a tree with the lowest branch being around 10 to 15 feet and lands feet first on one of the branches and sits there, squatting, whistling, and just staring around. Then it takes off. Faster than should be allowed in nature. I count to 10 in my head. The forest sleeps. I slowly make my way out from under the bush and begin to creep back towards camp, this time avoiding using my flashlight or making any noise if possible. I climb the embankment and take one last look towards the woods, unsure if it just happened or if I was asleep. I tumble down the other side of the embankment and return to the relative safety of the big S fire with Y and J, the other two who went for wood. "Where's your wood?" asks Y. "Oh, it had bugs. It's fine, we got a lot anyways." They stacked up a solid pile of oak and pine, not enough for the night but enough for a little while at least. "Where's R?" I ask warily. "Check the tent there, he was passed the hell out snoring the way he always does." "Well, okay then." I climbed into my sleeping bag to warm up a little bit because I was covered in snow when I got back and it screamed again. "Oh, please don't tell me it's coming here." The other two looked at me wide-eyed. Normally if I recognize a sound I say what it is out loud so they know what's up. I had no response. They asked if I heard the first one. Good, they heard it too. I answered with a nod as I unlocked the car in case we needed to book it. They asked if I saw it. Nod. What was it? No goddamn clue. I described it to them quietly so that I could listen for more noises and I told them about it imitating my voice. Y was pretty freaked out. Jay thought I was bullshitting him and said it was some kind of owl. I got out of my sleeping bag, threw my coat back on and joined them at the fire. For the first time in a while I looked at my phone, 5:45 a.m. We looked up native owl calls and came up empty-handed. The same happened with every other animal we tried. Jay seemed a little nervous. Y suggested that maybe it's a truck on the highway. "Yeah, that's probably it," I replied blankly and Jay gave me a look that said that he knew it probably wasn't. They didn't sleep. I forced sleep upon myself so that we wouldn't die on the car ride home. The next morning we went for a walk. It didn't snow much after I got back so you could kinda follow my footprints. The tree the thing leapt into was out of reach of me on Jay's shoulders. R was still asleep but I think I might have been able to reach it if I was on his. The tree I sat under had scratch marks on it. I think they're from deer shedding the velvet off of their antlers but it creeped me out nonetheless. The tree it sat under had footprints everywhere. There seemed to be no order to them at all. It was amazing. It looked like it had run over every inch too of that area, coming as close to the bush I was in as 2 meters lengths. I don't really know much about cryptids or anything, but when I got home I googled North American tall skinny cryptid and the second result was from Parade, a list of cryptids. After ruling out everything else on the list I came across the picture of a Wendigo that has antlers, not quite but pretty close, described as tall and skinny and super fast. I did my research and every picture has antlers but I can't find any evidence that, other than a few movies, it had antlers. IDK. What I saw definitely didn't have antlers but it matched everything else, even down to the whistling. This was kinda long but I'd appreciate some feedback. I posted this first on another subreddit, r/cryptids, but it wasn't received well.
Help! Just bought a home with property and something isn't right. I just bought a home on the Ohio/Michigan border. It is in the middle of the woods. I only own about 5 acres, but it is surrounded by over 600 acres of woodland. There is only one other house nearby. I've noticed a few strange things, and had a few strange things happen recently. I will explain in detail. I'm worried about the possibility of a Wendigo or skinwalker, but I am not knowledgeable on the subject and would like to learn as much as possible to protect my family. The red flags. An older single woman sold us the home. Her daughter and son-in-law were helping her sell it by owner. Many times the daughter mentioned about how her mother was paranoid living there. She had lived there for over 20 years, but now never leaves the home. Even though she is in good health. She said she would never answer the door whenever someone knocked, and there are cameras outside. There is also a flashlight in every room. They accepted our offer of almost $60,000 under asking price. We loved the property and told them that. But couldn't afford what they were asking. They met us where we could afford it. During the home inspection, the inspector tried opening a window and it was stuck shut. He went to try another and the homeowner stated, "None of the windows open, they haven't in years." I didn't think anything of it, and just assumed they were old and broken. Home was built in 1985 and has original windows. Inspector also found some issues with the exterior of the house, just appeared to be a lack of maintenance outside. Once again the family stated that the homeowner just didn't like to be outside anymore and spends all her time inside. I met with the homeowner at her house again so I could gather some measurements. While I was there she showed me how a few things in the home work. She made it a point to show me a light on a pole outside. She said, "If that light ever goes out, replace it immediately. It is way too dark out there without it." She has also stated that at night, we will hear coyotes right up against the house, as they like to gather by a bush near the front porch in the winter. A coworker of mine has lived in the woods 2 counties over for years. He just went through a rough divorce and was forced to sell his home. He just gifted me an axis deer skull with antlers. He said it was gifted to him when he bought his property and he kept it by his front door. He now wants me to have it, and suggested I hang it up outside. I'm a hunter and thought it was cool and never thought more of it until now. My fiancé and I have both been having nightmares. Not about a Wendigo, but my nightmare is about my newborn son getting possessed by something. I've had the dream a few times. My fiancé won't tell me about her dream. We haven't taken possession yet, but we will on November 6th. I'm concerned something is going on with this property and want to know if you all think I have anything to worry about. If you think I do, what can I do?
Terrifying Wendigo encounter during remote border crossing. We've got crows back at home. In my town we see them every day. Sometimes solo, sometimes in a group. I am well aware that a group of crows is referred to as a murder, but despite this ominous label, they're pretty shy and generally fly away at the first sign of danger. But the pair of big black birds circling the point across the lake were something else entirely. I know that around the Canadian border ravens become more common than crows, and this is what I suppose they were. But these were really big, too big, possibly bigger than an eagle. And as they circled the point, the calls they made were unnerving. Nothing like the call of a crow, the sounds were screeching drawn-out croaks, as though to make sure that every creature on the lake was aware of their presence. I kept quiet from my vantage point 200 yards across the bay, and the travelers I had in my charge knew enough to keep still and silent. We were 3/4 done with our journey that had begun at a clandestine location outside of Atkokan. I never thought I could become a smuggler, but here I was, tucked under ancient white pines with a man and woman who were essentially strangers to me. They watched the huge birds with me, whispering back and forth in their native language. I don't know what they were saying, but the look in their eyes showed their fear. And these people have seen things in their homeland bad enough for them to leave with nothing more than a few possessions, and then give all of their money to a stranger who arranged for me to take them through the wilderness to cross the most remote section of the largest unguarded border in the world, traveling by canoe along a route that my ancestors have traveled since long before there was a border. We had crossed the imaginary line last night, and by this time tomorrow I plan to load them into a van that would be waiting at a trailhead near Ely. This was where we would part ways. For now we were preparing to break camp at a campsite known only to me. I carved it out of the timber a few years ago, and it is able to conceal not only a tent but a canoe as well. There's not much canoe traffic this time of year, but I was doing a final check to make sure the coast was clear when the birds showed up. Figuring there must be something along the shore holding their interest, I fished my binoculars out of my pack to get a closer look at the sinister pair. To the naked eye it looked like a typical rocky point on a shield lake. A smooth rock shoreline gave way to a stand of sparse bulrushes with a couple of boulders. One of the boulders didn't look right. I realized that I was actually looking at a dead moose that had floated up there. Likely a casualty from the moose season that ended the week before. That explained why the pair of birds were circling, and I pulled the binoculars away to study how the birds were behaving. They took turns swooping down low over the moose and then soaring higher than the treetops and letting out their disturbing calls. Then there was movement in the trees. I pulled the binoculars back up and focused in on the mix of birch and fir that was along the shoreline. At first I thought it was a bear, coming down to take advantage of the dead moose. But this was far taller than a bear. Then I saw the antlers. Some smaller trees parted and then what at first I thought was a moose stepped to the water's edge. I've seen hundreds of moose in my time up here, but what I was seeing now didn't make sense. Sure, it had antlers, and it was tall like a moose. But it was mostly without fur, and the color was all wrong, more of a sickly pinkish gray than the dark brown you would expect of a moose. I could see its ribs. And its front legs weren't really legs, they were more like long, gangly arms. Arms that ended in long bony fingers. Even though I was about 200 yards away I could see the glint of fangs. It stepped from the trees to the water's edge. It paused and looked up at the circling birds. It let out a scream that hung in the air. One of my travelers let out a whimper, and I turned, put a raised finger across my lips. I knew we were out of sight of what any typical animal or person could see, but this was far from typical. I flashed back to many years before when I stared wide-eyed at my grandfather as he told stories around the campfire. Flames flickered and birch logs crackled as he described an evil spirit called the Wendigo. Many generations ago a lost hunter turned to cannibalism to survive, and his evil deed transformed him into a horrific beast. A beast that roamed the wilds with an insatiable hunger for flesh. Human or otherwise. While this story terrified me as a child, I never gave it any thought as an adult, as the elders had many tales of spirits and such. But here I was, miles from the nearest road, two strangers in my care, looking at the impossible. I subconsciously reached to feel the outline of my revolver tucked into the back of my pants. The beast had now waded into the water and its claws began tearing at the moose carcass. It ripped off huge chunks of flesh, hide, and bone with ease, shoving them into his gaping mouth where they were crunched and swallowed. The water around the moose carcass was soon tinged red with blood and the pair of giant birds took roost in a tall pine above the beast. The carnage continued as the creature consumed impossible amounts in minutes. I heard one of the travelers whisper Monstoro. I didn't need translation to know what it meant. They had every reason to be scared now. I've had face-to-face standoffs with wild bears, with big city gangs, with angry fathers. At least with those you have an idea of what you are dealing with. My grandfather never said how one would deal with a Wendigo. With most of the moose consumed, the monster let out another scream. I was back to looking through binoculars, which was a mistake as the beast's face and chest were covered in blood, and flesh clung to its claws. An image I will never be able to erase. Despite having consumed the better part of an adult moose, it was still gaunt in appearance. It took a last look around and I stopped breathing when its gaze seemed to focus on our location for a moment. It slowly turned towards shore and then disappeared into the brush. This cued the black birds to come down for what was left. One bird rested on the moose's hindquarter and picked away at intestines, the other rested on the head and feasted on the eyes and torn open neck. After a few minutes they flew up silently, circled over our location and then headed in the general direction the Wendigo had gone. At least they went in the opposite direction we were headed. We sat in silence for a time, then I pulled out a map. I showed the travelers where we were, where the Wendigo had gone, and where we needed to go to complete the journey. I showed them my gun, which I had kept hidden from them until now, hoping it would ease their fears. It didn't do much to ease my fears. It was a .357 revolver, enough to stop a bear, but what would it do to a Wendigo? I suspected there needed to be some version of a silver bullet to stop an evil spirit. I gestured to them to pack their belongings, which they did quickly and quietly. I calculated that if we traveled lightly and quickly we could be out by nightfall. I decided to leave the tent and everything else not essential. We slid the canoe down the bank, climbed in and pushed off. The woman sat on the floor in the middle, the man was at the bow. I paddled from the stern with intensity. We had about 10 miles to the end of the lake. At the end of the lake was a portage trail of about a half-mile that would bring us to the next lake. We had done a number of portages already on this trip, and after the morning's events I was dreading having to be on foot. There was no other way out. A light wind was at our back, allowing for relatively quick travel. The man was paddling as best he could, but it was marginally helpful at best. The woman kept her head down and did not move. Usually on this kind of trip I try to hug the shoreline to keep a low profile, but now we were tracking right down the middle of the lake. I was making a beeline for a height of land where I knew the portage was, and we continued along in silence. The paddle down the long lake was uneventful, and it was early afternoon when we reached the portage. Once ashore we took a short break and ate some jerky, and then it was time to make the portage. It would be easier now since I had abandoned most of the gear. On earlier portages I had the travelers hide out while I scouted ahead to make sure we would not meet anyone on the trail, but there was no time for that. I think they understood me as I tried to explain the importance of moving quickly and quietly. I pointed to the trail and then to the packs and paddles. They took the cue and I put the canoe up on my shoulders and we plodded along through the forest. It took less than an hour to get to the next lake. There was a forest fire here several years before, and the charred remains of a few old-growth pine stood in stark contrast to the young aspen, birch and spruce that had grown in the void left by the fire. This lake was smaller, with many bays and points, and we were soon back to making progress in the canoe. We came around a point midway down the lake. I looked to the end of the lake where we would find the next portage and stopped padding. Maybe 300 yards away was the remains of a burnt pine. Roosting in the tree were 2 birds. Big, black birds. The man in the bow saw them too, and muttered something to the woman. She looked up for the first time and stifled a scream. We had to go past them to get to the next portage, so I kept paddling down the middle, not taking my eyes off the birds. As we got closer it was obvious they were watching us too, their heads pivoting as we passed them. I kept looking back over my shoulder at them, but they held their position. I didn't know what the presence of the birds on our route signified, but based on what I saw this morning it couldn't be good. By the time we were at the end of lake where the next portage was, I could barely make out the tree anymore. I thought that perhaps we were in the clear, but then we all heard the unmistakable sound, the same sound we heard the birds making this morning. Even though they had to be over a mile away there was no mistaking it. The long, drawn-out croaking continued for a minute, then it was silent again. I paddled towards shore so hard that the bow slid 2 feet onto the bank. "Go! Go! Go!" I yelled. The travelers seemed shocked at my yelling, as I had not said anything to them in the few days we had been together that wasn't a whisper. They both scrambled out of the canoe, grabbed the gear and headed up the path. I again wrestled the canoe onto my shoulders and followed. We still had another lake to cross after this portage, then it was down a creek to where we were to be picked up in a remote parking lot at the end of a forest road. We would be early, but maybe I could get a cell phone signal and get a call or text to the driver. Or maybe we could hitch a ride with a tourist. Any concerns of being intercepted by authorities has now taken a back seat to getting out of here and away from that thing that for all I knew was making its way south toward us. Since we were closer to an access point, this mile-long portage was well traveled and we made good time. The first half was up a slight incline, then it went down much more steeply to the next lake. We reached the top, and paused for a quick rest. I set the canoe down to catch my breath. The crest of the trail allowed a good view of the valley ahead. It also allowed a good view of two huge, black birds that were circling above the treetops. The woman was not able to stifle her scream this time, and this prompted the birds to start up with their ominous calls. In the distance we heard another sound. It was a scream that could have only come from the horror we had seen this morning. While I felt a certain amount of responsibility to the travelers, my concern for them was waning. "You better keep up," I yelled as hoisted the canoe back onto my shoulders. I headed down the steep trail as fast as I could, and I could hear the travelers behind me, stumbling, but not falling too far behind. With the canoe on my shoulders I couldn't see if they were carrying the paddles. Didn't matter, I keep a spare strapped to the supports in the canoe. The steep path made a switchback and was able to see that the man was indeed carrying a paddle and pack. The woman was crying hysterically, carrying nothing. The path here was steep and rough, with many large rocks and roots creating potential tripping hazards. The birds were circling overhead us now, their croaks echoing off the hillside. We heard the distant scream again, although this time it didn't sound so distant. It was not possible for us to move any faster, but I took care to be sure-footed. I could see we were nearly to the bottom of the hill. Once there it would be level ground to the next lake, which was now only a few hundred yards away. I made it to the bottom of the hill where the well-worn path went through a series of large roots and then turned to dirt. Once to the dirt I flipped the canoe off my shoulders and let it land on the hull. The travelers were coming up 50 yards behind me. I grabbed the bow of the canoe and started dragging it, hoping the man would catch up and grab the stern. I started to yell at the couple to hurry, but I was interrupted by another scream from the beast. It was coming from our right and I could now hear branches breaking and what sounded like breathing and snarling. There was no reason to think that the lake would offer refuge from this thing, but it seemed like a better option than facing it here on the path. The man was almost caught up to me, but he stopped to see where his partner was. She had tripped on a root and was now screaming, not sure if it was in pain or terror. Probably more terror, as the Wendigo had broken through the brush along the trail and was now 50 feet behind her. She looked back at it and let out what she meant to be a scream but came out as a yelp. The beast was on her in seconds, and it picked her up over its head and slammed her to the ground. The man dropped to his knees, watching in horror as his partner was torn apart and devoured. Wendigo resumed dragging the canoe as fast as I could, not looking back. The beast let out another shriek, then there was a scream that I presumed to be from the man. I tried not to think about the snapping and crunching sounds I could hear from behind me. The next lake was now in sight, and even though my entire body wanted to quit, I was now running. The shoreline was sandy and I ran right into the water, allowing the canoe to float past me. I hopped in when the back seat was even with me, and in one motion pulled the tag end of the knot that held my spare paddle in place. A few quick strokes and I was 20 yards from shore. The screams of the beast continued, and the black birds that had been watching the bloodbath from treetops now were starting to swoop around me, getting closer with each pass. The Wendigo was now on the shoreline and it let out the loudest scream of all. It stepped in the water to its knees but stopped, gesturing with its long arms and howling at the sky. Not knowing what to do next, I pulled out my revolver. At the end of this lake was the outlet stream that would lead me to a bridge. For the moment I felt safer where I was. The birds were getting ever bolder, and I could feel the wind as one of them swooped in on me from behind my shoulder. It wheeled around over the bow and came right back at me. It reared back at arm's length with its wings spread and its talons coming right at my face. Taking advantage of a perfect opportunity, I pointed the gun barrel at the bird's center and pulled the trigger. Black feathers flew and the now silenced bird landed in the water and strangely sank out of sight. The other bird flew up high and then quickly descended, coming right at me. I had the gun raised, but the bird did not offer a good target and it flew past my head. Sensing weakness, it circled around and attacked, pecking me on the back of the head with its massive beak. I had to be careful not to tip as I tried to fend it off with the paddle. More determined than ever, the bird came back at me. I fired twice, missing both times. With 3 rounds left in the gun, I knew I better choose my next shots carefully. The bird came from behind me again. This time it wheeled around quickly, planting its talons on my chest and pecking at my eyes. My attempts to fend it off with a fist were not successful and it got a hold of my eyebrow. I could feel flesh pulling away from my skull, and I pointed the gun right at it, and even though I thought the barrel was pressed right into it, I still missed. I resorted to using the gun as a bludgeon that I slammed into its neck. This had a noticeable effect. It let out a deep croak and let go its grip. I was not watching the Wendigo at this point, focused on the dark feathered assailant. I could hear it though, as it let out shrieks and screams louder than a siren. The remaining black bird, shook up some from the pistol whipping, flew in a crooked path now, obviously having difficulty maintaining its course. I felt confident I could take it down with one of my remaining rounds. It came straight at me. I let it peck the top of my head as it went by. It circled around again, and once more I let it get me with a good peck to my temple. It made another loop around, and I was ready when it followed the same path of attack. It came right at me, and I was looking down the barrel right at the bird's head when I pulled the trigger. The raven's head disintegrated and a cloud of black feathers and blood in the headless body landed at my feet, wings still flapping, talons still grasping. The shrieks of the Wendigo suddenly stopped. It stood motionless, staring out at the lake, not necessarily at me. I set the gun on the seat next to me. There was still 1 round left. I used the paddle as a shovel to lift the dead bird over the side and into the lake, where it too strangely sank out of sight. The Wendigo, while still a fearsome-looking beast with its face and claws covered in blood and flesh, had lost its menacing posture. I pointed the revolver at it, right at its head. I was confident I could hit it, not confident that my 1 remaining bullet would kill it. For some reason I thought about the old saying, that if carrying a handgun for bear protection you should save the last round for yourself. Pretty sure the old saying applies here. I lowered the gun and watched the beast. With its long bony arms hanging at its sides it turned towards shore, and with 2 big steps it was crashing through the timber, heading away from the lake, away from me, away from my exit point. I sat quietly for a minute, trying to take all of this in. I could no longer hear the sounds of branches breaking. Was the Wendigo gone? Apparently they can't, or won't swim. The ravens must act as seers or scouts for the Wendigo. Once they were eliminated, it was like a switch was flipped. I thought about the hapless travelers. I knew it was pointless to go back to where I had last seen them. What would happen to me when I left the lake? It was now late in the afternoon. I slid the revolver with its 1 bullet into the back of my jeans, picked up the paddle and headed for the outlet creek.